Resourceful Designer, episode 135. Failure is always an option.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. He's never tried a flavor of potato chips that he didn't like. Mark Dickout.
Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this week's episode, I talk about failure and how you should be thinking about it. I also share a little plug for my fellow podcasters before ending with a great question from Mark about what sort of files to provide to other designers. Now, this is a special time of year for me. September 30th marks the 3-year anniversary of Resourceful Designer. Not only that, but September 30th is International Podcast Day, a day where podcasters and podcast listeners around the world celebrate podcasting. Now, I did choose International Podcast Day as my launch date back in 2015 as a day I would remember, which makes it very easy every year to celebrate. So I just want to take a quick second here to thank you for tuning into the podcast. Whether you're new to the show, you've listened to a few episodes, or you've listened to all of them, it doesn't matter. I appreciate you so much taking the time, listen to me. Hopefully I'm sharing some great advice and you're learning things. I love the emails I get from listeners or the messages on social media letting me know that I've made a difference in their business. Some people actually have told me that they've left their full-time job to start a business after listening to my podcast. And I find that so encouraging that designers are embracing this lifestyle of, I hate the term, but freelancing. I much prefer home-based designer. But just embracing this entrepreneurial lifestyle. And I'm just honored that I can help in any way I can. So thank you once again for tuning in. And if you aren't already subscribed to the podcast, if you're just listening on the website or you found a link somewhere, if you go to resourcefuldesigner.com/subscribe, I have all the ways you can get to the podcast, whether you're on an Apple device, an Android device, or you want to listen on Spotify, or if you would prefer, download the app for Android or Apple and listen that way. Everything can be found there. It's also a great link that you can share with fellow designers when you tell them about the podcast. And that's what International Podcast Day is all about, sharing podcasts. So if you know a designer that you think would appreciate the show, maybe it's a student, maybe it's an established designer, somebody who's getting frustrated with their job and are thinking of going the freelance lifestyle, let them know about the podcast and give them that one link, resourcefuldesigner.com/subscribe, so they can get involved as well. Now, speaking of subscribing to podcasts, that's what International Podcast Day is all about. Not necessarily subscribing, but just building awareness of podcasting. And that's what I want to share as this week's resource. I know it's not necessarily a design resource, although there are some other great design podcasts out there you can listen to. But not just for that. If you have a hobby that you're into, or maybe there's a sports team you like, or a certain culture, maybe you're into Star Wars or golf, pottery. Maybe you or a loved one is suffering from a certain illness. Maybe you're ex-military or know someone in law enforcement. Whatever it is, there is a podcast out there for you. September 30th is a day for celebrating the vast variety of podcasts available to just about anyone. I mean, I look at my podcast list and I'm subscribed to 40 different podcasts. Some of them are news podcasts. I've got several that are Canadian podcasts. I've got podcasts about TV shows I like. Because I do podcasts, I listen to podcasts about podcasting, as well as motivational podcasts and educational podcasts and business podcasts, as well as audio dramas. It's like listening to a play without visuals. You're hearing it. So all of this to say, regardless of what your interests are, I know you're listening to this podcast, so you're already familiar with podcasting and podcasts. But I just want to encourage you to go out and look to see if there's anything else in your life that you enjoy, that maybe there's a podcast about it, or share with somebody else who isn't into podcasts and show them that there's a podcast out there for whatever interests they have. So that's this week's resource of the week, or maybe you can call it tip of the week or whatever. I know it's not a design resource, but in honor of International Podcast Day and the 3-year anniversary of this podcast, I felt I should share that. And now, failure is always an option. I love that line. Failure is always an option. I first heard that on the television show Mythbusters, or heard it. I saw it. Adam Savage used to wear a t-shirt on the show. And if you're not familiar with Mythbusters, it was an American television show where the hosts would research certain myths or stories, or sometimes it was something they read on the internet, and they would test it to see if it was true or fail. They would pass it or bust it, as they would say. And a lot of scientific principles and things would go into the research and the testing. And Adam Savage, one of the hosts, would often wear a t-shirt that said, "Failure is always an option." Now, I don't know if he coined the phrase or if it originated with him, but he's the one who really popularized it. And I've always loved that quote, "Failure is always an option." Because failure is how we learn. Failure allows us to improve. It allows us to expand. It allows us to grow. When you fail at something badly enough, whatever you did wrong, you probably won't repeat that same mistake again. That's how powerful failure is. Now, of course, this is a graphic design podcast, and I'm talking to you, a designer. So when I say failure here, I'm talking about your designs, and specifically when your designs are rejected. You know what I'm talking about. That great logo design that you created, the one that wasn't accepted by your client, and it didn't matter how hard you worked on it or how much you loved the design, your client didn't. Or maybe it's that cutting edge poster that you did that was quote unquote too wild for the event it was promoting. Well, those designs may have been great in your mind, but they were still rejected. And when they're rejected, that means they were a failure. Who knows? Maybe the client had different tastes than you do. Or maybe the market just wasn't ready for the innovative approach that you took to the poster. Or, and I'm just putting this out there, maybe, just maybe, there's a possibility that your idea stunk and you just didn't see it. But whatever the reason, your design failed. Now, in preparation for this episode, I looked up some quotes on failure, and there are some really good ones. Henry Ford wrote, "Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently." Or from LeBron James, NBA basketball star, he said, "You have to be able to accept failure to get better." Both are great quotes, but one of the favorite ones that I found was from Winston Churchill, who said, "Success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." And that one fits so well. As a designer, you can't let rejections get you down. And yet I see it all the time in design communities like Facebook groups. Designers moping around because a client didn't like their idea. It happens. Don't fret on it. After a rejection, pick yourself up and just get back in it. Try something else. Think of the way you design. Think of your draft process when you're designing something. Chances are you don't just come up with one single idea and present it to your client. If you do, if that is how you work, then maybe that's why your designs are being rejected. But most designers go through various ideas, various incarnations of those ideas. Sometimes dozens, if not hundreds of ideas before settling on something that they think is viable to present to the client. Now, if you look at all those earlier drafts, most of the time, they're very poor compared to the presented version. In fact, I say most of the time, they should always be poor compared to the presented version. That's all part of the progression of design. Your ideas get better as they're refined. And if you look at all those previous incarnations, you can view each one of them as a failure. A failure that allowed you to progress to the next version or the next idea, which was an improvement over the last idea. It's how we improve. So when a client rejects one of your designs, instead of seeing it as a failure, see it as one more step in the process. Maybe you showed them a design before it was ready. You thought it was ready, but it was just another step in the process. There may be more variations of that design to explore. Or maybe you hadn't stretched your creativity enough to come up with the next, even better idea. All of this is part of the creative process and shouldn't really be viewed as a failure because it's not productive to do so. And if a client turning down your design pushes you to create something even better, then nobody will remember your previous unsuccessful attempts. So don't fret on it. Now, the trick to getting past this failure or these rejections as a creative is to try not to become overly attached to your ideas or your concepts. I know, that's tough. We're creative people. You work hard to create something that, in your mind, you think it's amazing. Something that you love. You're ready to present this design and you know that it'll just blow their socks off, whatever that means. And yet you're shocked when the client doesn't like it as much as you do. Even more so when the client rejects the idea. You feel defeated because in your mind's eye, it was the perfect design. But that's where the problem lies. When you become so, enamored in what it is you design, it actually stifles. It blocks your creativity. And it prevents you from improving. You think that that one design is the perfect design. And you can't think of anything else to do. If you think that way, you'll never progress as a designer. Now, don't get me wrong. It's okay to be proud of your work. It's okay to love the designs you do. It's not okay to think that every design you do is perfect. If they were, you would be the best designer in the world. And I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but chances are you never will be the best designer in the world. But you should be striving to be an extremely good designer. And every design you create, no matter how good you think it is still just a stepping stone. It's another one of, I talked about your draft process beforehand. Those final designs that you present to clients, in your overall design career, your design life, those are still just drafts. Because each one of those that you do, whether they're rejected or not, are still just stepping stones to even better work yet to come. Because you're constantly learning, you're constantly growing. And part of that growing and learning experience is accepting failure or rejections whenever they come and moving past them. So if you want to be a successful designer, you need to learn to brush off those rejections. Use those failures as a learning experience to improve your skills, to improve your abilities, and become an even better designer than you are now. And one more thing, just because a client rejects a design, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad design. It just means the client didn't like it. If you really liked a design that a client rejected, put it aside. Recycle it someday in the future if there's ever a use for it. Maybe a year down the road, you'll pull it out and you'll look at it, and at that time, you'll see the flaws in it and realize that there were things that you didn't see before about it that, yeah, maybe it's not the best design. Or maybe a year from now, you'll pull it out and you'll say, wow, that design still stands up. I still love it. And then you could adjust it a little bit and present it to another client who will appreciate it. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you may remember the story I shared several episodes ago about an early logo design I created for a local carpenter. I presented what I thought was a perfect design to him, and I was so proud. I couldn't wait for him to see it. And when he saw it, He just brushed it aside. He didn't like it. And then he asked me to design something which turned out to be one of the worst logos I've ever designed. I was so ashamed of it, but it's what the client wanted. I'm not going to go into the whole story. But that rejected design, I held on to it. Not for the purpose of using it again. It's just I love the design so much that I didn't want to get rid of it. So I held on to it. And I don't even remember how much time passed. But later, there was another client that came in. It wasn't a carpenter. It was a completely different client. But when I started thinking about what to do for that client, that idea, that rejected design came back in my head and I pulled it out. And with some adjustments, I was able to present it to this client who absolutely loved it. So keep that in mind that just because a client rejects a design, yes, it may be considered a failure in regards to that client, but that doesn't mean the design itself is a failure. It may have a use in the future. So remember, design is subjective. Not everyone has the same idea of what looks good and what looks bad. So when you present something to a client, no matter what you think of it or how good you think it is, just be prepared because failure is always an option. Now, I would love to know what stories you have about failure. Have you had some really amazing designs that the client just rejected or didn't like that broke your heart? Have you created some amazing designs only to look at them later down the road, a year or 2, 3 down the road, look back at them and realize that they weren't nearly as good as you thought they were? I would love to know. Please leave me a comment for this episode at resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 135. And now, this week's question of the week. This week's question comes in from Mark. It says, "Hi Mark, what is your policy on sharing the source files with your clients? Some years ago, I created a series of packaging label for a small coffee roaster. Years later, a person I did not know emailed me mentioning that he was now doing a project with the client and needed the Photoshop files. Although this was an easy task for me to do, it just didn't sit right with me. I contacted the client to verify this person, and they told me they were working on an advertising campaign and that the person was in marketing. In the end, I sent the marketer a flattened PDF file, and interestingly enough, I ended up working with him on a future project. I have had discussions with others about openly sharing source files with clients. Some say they, meaning the clients, paid for them by paying for your services, while others say absolutely not. What do you say, Mark?" Well, thank you very much for that question. And as you said, this is one of those discussions that since the dawn of design has been going on. And I can tell you that I've flip-flopped over the years. When I first started, I didn't believe in giving anything away because, well, first of all, I started off in the design industry before computers. My first job at the print shop, there were no computers there. We were doing actual paste up, cutting ruby liths and all that fun stuff. So we never dreamed of handing that stuff over to a client because if we did, we wouldn't have anything again. If anything happened to that and the client came back, we wouldn't be able to do anything for the client. We needed those physical pieces in order to complete any future jobs. And what the client was paying us for was the finished design. So a lot of that carried over, and I know a lot of designers that thought that same way. The client is actually paying you for the finished design piece, whether it's a printed piece or a PDF file, like even if it is a printed, you can give the PDF, but not what you're using to make it. Some say it's akin to going to a restaurant. You're paying for the meal they're serving you. You're not paying for all the ingredients that are going into the meal, because otherwise you can say, okay, well, that was a great steak and potato. I want the leftover potatoes. I want the leftover corn. I want all the stuff that went into it. There was some seasoning. Can I get the rest of the bottle of seasoning? Because I need all this stuff to take over somewhere else so that they can create this thing again. No, you paid for the final or the finished meal. Well, a lot of designers thought that same way. And I was one of them at some point. Where no, if you needed something, I gave you a PDF at the end. And if you needed a whatever source files, I would just give you the minimum so that you can get by without compromising my future connection to the client. Now, I'm a little bit more lenient these days. I just realized there was just way too much frustration in it. So nowadays, I do give stuff. If somebody calls and they need something, especially if it's another designer and it's a legitimate thing, they need to do something, I'll help them out because you never know when I might have to turn to that designer or that marketing person, in your case, for something in the future. So I'll help them out. Now, what I won't give them is anything that's licensed. So if there's a font involved, like say it's a Photoshop file and there's all sorts of different layers, I will rasterize the font layers before providing it. If there's stock imagery involved, if it's on like a Photoshop layer or stuff like that, I'll do that, but I will not provide the original stock photos that were downloaded from the stock photo site because I have the licenses for those. So that sort of things. And sometimes if there's something really special I did, like say there's a background image and it's made up of, 4, 5, 6, a dozen layers, I will go in and sometimes flatten those so that it creates one background image. And then the text would be on a different layer. And if there's some other elements on a different layer. But sometimes that's actually to help somebody out, depending on if I know what they're going to do with it. So for the most part, I'm okay with giving the stuff away. As I said, I'd go in and tweak it little bits because if you don't give the fonts with the file and it messes everything up, that's why I rasterize the font file. And I'll even tell them what font it was and where they can purchase the font themselves. So I guess to answer your question is, to a limited extent, I give everything if requested. Now, I have in the past, depending on how old the client is, like say if a client comes to me and I haven't done any work for them in 3, 4, 5 years, and they need stuff, and I have to go through my archives because I don't keep everything on my computer. I might have to go through another hard drive I have put aside with some stuff on it or that. I will charge them for that. And I'll say there's a minimum fee of whatever. And I'll tell them up front. I says, well, because I have to go and retrieve this and I have to check everything, make sure it's the right stuff. And that takes time away from my day. There's going to be minimum charge. Do you want to go ahead with that? And most of the time the client will just say yes. And I do that. So I charge the client for the minimum fee. And then I get everything ready for them and send it off wherever it has to go. But if it's a more recent client, then I don't bother with that, especially if the files are already here and I'm familiar with them. If it's something as I said, if it's something I haven't seen in 3, 4 years, I might have to refamiliarize myself with the files before I can send them off. So, long answer for what could have been really short is, although I don't view it as the client paid or didn't pay for the files, I just found it's less of a headache to provide them whenever they're asked for. And you know what? If it turns out that the reason somebody else wants the file is because the client is going to a different designer, they don't want to work with you anymore, I'm always one for not burning bridges. So provide whatever I can to the new person so that the client will benefit from it. Because if you don't, what you're actually doing is hurting the client, not just the other designer. You're hurting the client as well. And if you don't do that, if you make it easy for them, there's always the possibility in the future that the client comes back to you. So that's the answer to your question, Mark. Hope it's satisfactory. As I mentioned, lots of designers have different opinions on this, but that's my opinion. Now, I would love to get your question for a future episode of the podcast. If you have something to ask, head on over to resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback and submit your question. Now, I want to share another great iTunes review I received. This one is from Jess from Sydney, Australia. She says, amazing, I have been binge listening. It is a wonderful podcast full of practical ideas and information. I love listening while I work, but I find myself stopping to scribble down notes and reminders. So valuable. I've just binged about 10 episodes. Thank you so much, Mark. Jess from Sydney, Australia. Well, thank you very much for that, Jess. And I just realized that earlier I said, whenever I started reading the review, I said she, but Jess could be for a guy or a girl. So Jess from Sydney, Australia, thank you very much. I don't know if you're a guy or a girl, but either way, I appreciate the review. It means so much to me. I love getting these things and reading them all over the world. It's amazing to see how many places around the world people are listening to Resourceful Designer. It really is humbling. So thank you very much for that. And before I go, I just want to thank everyone who is supporting Resourceful Designer on Patreon. It doesn't matter at what level you are, even if it's just for $1 a month. Your pledge means so much to me, and it helps me cover the costs of this podcast. As you've noticed, I have had a few sponsors in the past, but I really don't want sponsors. Most of the people that contact me to sponsor the podcast are not people that I would recommend on the show, so I don't want to have them as a sponsor. I said when I started off that I would only recommend. That's why my resource of the week is stuff that I use, stuff I would actually recommend, that I have knowledge of. And most of these people that approach me to sponsor the show, that's not the case. So I don't accept them as a sponsor, which means that all the costs involved with this podcast come out of my pocket, including the time I take away from designing in order to do this podcast. So everybody who supports the show on Patreon, that just helps to cover some of those costs, those expenses that I do putting out the show. So thank you very much for everybody. Regardless of the level of contribution, I appreciate you so much. Now, if you're not supporting the show and you would like to do so, head on over to resourcefuldesigner.com/Patreon, that's Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, less than the cost for a cup of coffee, you too can help support the show. So thank you once again for tuning in. I always love having you around here as we discuss our graphic design businesses and ways to improve them. But that's it for this week. So until next time, I am Mark DeCote, wishing you all the best and reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer Podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.